Hello friends, so today our topic is hazards, risks and vulnerability of the disaster management of IGNO course. Okay, so in this course we are going to cover the objective orientation, introduction, understanding hazards, understanding risks, risk assessment and evaluation, risk precipitation, risk identification, understanding vulnerability identification, types of vulnerability, vulnerability and risk assessment, vulnerability factors, and conclusion glossary reference. Okay, so first of all, objective. After reading this unit, you are acquire conceptual understanding of relevant disaster terminology, discuss vulnerability factors in brief, and understand vulnerability and risk assessment. Okay, so let's first the glossary. Okay, see here glossary. Biological hazards, process of organic origin or those conveyed by biological vectors, including exposure to pathogenic microorganisms, toxins, and bioactive substances, which may cause the loss of life or injury, property damage, social and economic destruction, or environmental degradation. Examples of biological hazards are outbreaks of epidemic disease, plant or animal contagion, insect plague, and extensive infections. Disaster, serious disruption of the functioning of society, causing widespread human, material, or environmental losses which exceed the ability of the affected people to cope using its own resources. Disasters are natural and man-made. Geological hazards. Geological hazards include internal earth process or tectonic origin such as earthquakes, tsunami, volcanic activity, and emissions, as well as external processes such as mass movements, landslides, rock slides, rock falls, or avalanches, surface collapse, expansive soils, and debris or mud flows. Geological hazards can be single, sequential, or combined in their origin and effects. For example, floods, debris, and mud floods, tropical cyclones, storm surges, thunder, hailstorms, rain and wind storms, blizzards, and other severe storms, drought, desertification, wildland fires, temperature extremes, sand or dust storms, far frost, snow, or ice avalanches. Hazards. A precise definition of hazards is difficult. The International Secretariat of Disaster Reduction has defined hazard as a potentially damaging physical event, phenomenon, or human activity that may cause the loss of life or injury, property damage, social and economic destruction, or environmental degradation. Hazards have both natural and human components. Hydrometeorological hazards. These hazards are of atmospheric, hydrological, or oceanographic nature. Hydrometeorological hazards include floods, debris, and mud floods, tropical cyclones, storm, surge, thunder or hailstorm, rain and wind storms, blizzards, and other several storms, drought, desertification, wildlife, land fires, temperature extreme, sand or dust storms, pre performed and snow or ice avalanches. Hydrometeorological hazards can be single, sequential, or combined in their origin and effects. Risks is explained as the likelihood or probability of a losses. Risks could be voluntary, as for example, a game of boxing or bullfighting, or in voluntary, which is unforeseen and unprepared for. The word is employed in general uses as also technical uses, whereby it denotes the extent of likely damage or the hazard potential of a particular event. Okay, so now see the introduction of this topic, hazard risk and vulnerability. Introduction. Throughout the 20th century, the theory and practice of disaster management has been dominated by the scientific perspective, whereby disasters were thought of purely as a geological or a climatic problem, the solution for which lay in engineering and management sciences. In the last 2 decades, there has been a para- paradigmatic shift in the understanding of disaster per se, the human factor, which had been neglected in the earlier approach, is now in focus. The attempt, consequently, is to inquire into sociological processes that determine or undermine a community's resilience, coping capacity, and response to disaster. Presently, the term disaster is a more inclusive concept in that it includes man-made and technological hazards, as also terrorism, which has added a new dimension to its understanding. There are two important perceptions of disaster. According to one school of thought, disasters are natural, revengeful acts of nature, an opportunity for man to atone for his sins, wherein death and destruction are inevitable. As for the other perspective, disasters are man-made, an event, whether a product of natural phenomena or human activities, turns out to be a catastrophic disaster if the community or society fails to adequately cope up with it. Natural hazards do not necessarily lead to disasters. Intense, inevitable, or unpredictable natural hazards like tsunamis, cyclones, and earthquakes prove to be disaster only when the population is affected, and more so when it is unprepared to respond to the unable to cope with it. Disaster sociologist Carl 1932 has endeavored to understand disasters in terms of social action. Carr indicates that disasters are the collapse, that is, failure or inadequacy of cultural protection as a result of human activities and not of natural or supernatural forces. Therefore, they are essentially human made. An understanding of causes of disasters and timely, appropriate interven- intervention can effectively reduce the disaster threat. Understanding hazards. Hazard is defined as a potential or a latent or dormant cause which is activated when the right configuration of factors, natural or man-made, of both present themselves. For example, a chemical plant in a populated area presents a hazard having a potential threat to life and property in that area or within defined vicinity. Disaster is the actual occurrence of the apprehended catastrophe. Hence, disaster is any occurrence that causes damage, ecological disruption, loss of human life, deterioration of health and health services on a scale sufficient to warrant the extraordinary response from outside the affected community or area. World Declaration. A hazard technically is not a disaster unless the trigger, natural or man-made, sets it off. Disaster involving large-scale loss of life and property is a sudden onset event on a scale large enough to require outside assistance, which threatens the continuity of social system and process. A disaster should be defined on the basis of its human consequence, not on the phenomenal hazards that caused it. Earthquake, floods, and cyclones are natural hazards, which cause large-scale loss of life and property. Disaster when the trigger mechanism natural or man-made is activated. Risk is a technical concept which is used by engineering and management specialists to arrive at an estimation of losses in the event of disaster and the expected probability of its occurrence. Elements are identified as life and property likely to suffer damage in the event of disaster. Observation and precipitation of risks involving ascertaining specifically such elements at risk. Identification of risks involves inquiring into the specific natural, technological, or chemical, etc. Press- process that create the probability of the elements identified for risk analysis. Vulnerability can be natural or man-made. It can be physical owing to factors such as the weak building habitation in hazard-prone areas or socioeconomic arising due to poverty or magni- margi- marginalization of the weaker section of society who lack the wherewithal of defending themselves in the event of disaster. Hazards, extreme geographical events, biological process, and major technological accidents is known as hazards. Characterized by concentrated release of energy or materials, which pose a large unexpected threat to human life and can cause significant damage to goods and environment, are described as hazards. The difference between a hazard and a disaster is very important and crucial. A disaster takes place when a community is affected by a hazard, usually defined as an event that exceeds the community capacity to cope. In other words, the impact of the disaster is determined by the extent of a community's vulnerability to the hazards. This vulnerability is not natural, it is the human dimension of disasters, the result of the whole range of economic, social, cultural, institutional, political, and even psychological factors that shape people's lives and create the environment that they live in. 2001. Observation and perce- perception of hazards. The hazards could be classified on many criteria. Some of the general classifications are as follows. S. Gopalakrishnan hazards could be sudden onset hazards, geological and climatic hazards, earthquakes, tsunamis, floods, tropical storms, volcanic eruptions, landslides, snow onset hazards, environmental hazards, drought, famine, environmental degradation, desertification, defer- deforestation, and pest in- infestation, industrial technological system failure, accidents, spillage, explosion, fires, wars and civil strife, armed aggression, insurgency, terrorism, and other action leading to displaced person and refugee epidemics, and or foodborne disease, person-to-person disease, contact and respiratory spread, vector-borne disease, and complications from wounds. Hazards could also be classified as direct and indirect. For example, earthquake hazards would lead to direct and indirect consequences tabulated as under direct hazards, ground shaking, differential ground settlement, soil liquefaction, immediate landslide or mudslides, ground launching and avalanches, permanent ground displacement along faults, flood from tidal waves, sea surges and tsunamis, etc. Indirect hazards, dam failure, pollution from damage or to industrial plants, delayed landslides. Besides, hazards can be of both short-term and long-term duration. As per the classification process by K. Smith 1996, identification of hazards. Identification of hazards involves analysis of scientific data to trace the causal path of events leading up to the disaster. For example, identification of chemicals causing water pollution, their source, impact on specific elements such as human health, etc., inquiring into the nature and characteristics of a hazard with a view to distinguish the man-made and natural components. Therefore, for example, floods which are caused by both natural and man-made factors. Man-made factors include bad land use management policies such as allowing habitation and locating critical facilities in flood-prone areas, etc., which increase the vulnerability of exposed population. It also entails policy analysis in that the unintended unintended consequences of policies have to be examined with the view of framing more environment-friendly legislation in the future. Hazard analysis is the basis of sustainable development policies. For example, desertification in a slow onset disaster. Desertification arises from the interaction between a difficult, unreliable, and sensitive dry land environment and the human use and occupation of it in an effort to make a living. Following a hazards analysis of the process of desertification, effective strategy can be devised to address the problem. Hazard can be short-term duration. Most of the widely recognized hazards, such as earthquakes, volcanoes, severe weather conditions occur naturally in the environment. Another group of hazards is created by the action of human beings. Pollution of water, fire hazards, and air frequently fall into the man-made hazards category and include high levels of carbon monoxide (CO) and sulfur dioxide (SO2) in the atmosphere. Other man-made hazards include oil spills, pesticides, etc., which build up in the environment as a result of or due to excessive or repeated application of chemicals by agriculturalists and flooding and erosion resulting from inappropriate land management practice. Flooding, for example, may be the result of ill-conceived policies which has allowed construction and intensive land use on flood plains and flood-prone regions. Understanding risks. Risk is precisely defined by the International Strategy for Disaster Reduction (ISDR) as the probability of human harmful consequences or expected losses, death, injury, property, livelihood, economic activity disrupted, or environmental damage resulting from interaction between natural or human included hazards and vulnerable conditions. Conventionally, risk is expressed by the notation risk equal to hazards into vulnerability. Okay. Some disciplines also include the concept of exposure to refer particular to the physical aspects of vulnerability. In scenario analysis, risk is different from threat. Threat is more abstract concept. Risk is an expression of perceived threat in specific terms. Threat is a danger that has an extremely low probability of occurrence. For purposes of public policy, threat has to be articulated objectively in terms of component risks, the probability of their occurrence and damages involved. The difference is most clearly illustrated by the precautionary principle, which needs specific articulations of risks involved for development of comprehensive strategy to mitigate risks involved. A set of well-defined risks has to be derived from threat before an action project, innovation, or experiment is allowed to proceed. For example, offensive of terrorism was a threat. No policy could be devised to meet the threat, which led to September 11 attacks in United States. Threats was not articulated at risks as risks for preventive policy in this regard. Vulnerability is understood as a system fault or weakness which a threat exploits to create the negative impact. Risk management involves minimizing the vulnerabilities so as to reduce the impact of the threat. Risks created or exist are both inherent in social system due to specific environmental variables in the ecology of a system. This ecological context is therefore significant in understanding of vulnerabilities of people in different cultures as the causes of vulnerability and the level of risk precipitation in different countries is like to be different. Risk contains a probability of harmful consequence or accident, losses, deaths, injured property, livelihood, economic activity disrupted, or environment damaged, resulting from interaction between natural and human include induced hazards and vulnerability conditions. Risks are mainly witnessed due to the increased pressure on resource or because of the side effects of external leakages and intervention intense use to a resource in mountains exposes them. As a result, it leads to serious degradation. Major forces behind such intensified resource use are rapid population growth, market induced demand, greed of the rich, and resource exploit, exploitative public policies. Irrespective of the factors behind resource use intensification, invariable consequences are the disruption of conditions conducive to biophysical process that finally harm to the stability and sustainability of mountain environments. Risk assessment and evaluation. Risk assessment is defined as the methodological to determine the nature and extent of risks by analyzing potential hazards and evaluating existing conditions of vulnerability that could pose a potential threat or harm to people, property, livelihood, and the environment on which they depend. Such assessment has significant administrative implications in that precise understanding of the underlying process of formulation of targeted risk reduction policies, precise quantification of risk is often difficult in the absence of adequate data and proper analysis techniques. Moreover, certain areas are multi-hazard prone, which pose another challenge for risk assessment. Risk reduction policy for such areas would require a risk assessment regarding each hazard to arrive at an estimation of total losses. Besides, risks are not amenable to simple qualifications and cannot be easily either identified or quantified. Disaster risk is seen as a function of the hazard, exposure, and vulnerability denoted by the mathematical function. Disaster risk function equal to function hazard, exposure, vulnerability. Okay, where exposure refers to the element which is affected by natural disaster, people and or property. To reduce disaster risks, it is important to reduce the level of vulnerability and to keep exposure as far away from hazards as possible by relocating population and property away from the hazard prone zone. Wisconsin Disaster Management Center. The process of conducting a risk assessment is based on a review of both the technical features of hazards such as their location, intensity, frequency, and probability, and also the analysis of the physical, social, economic, and environmental dimensions of vulnerability and exposure, while taking particular account of the coping capabilities pertinent to the risk scenarios. ISDI risk evaluation entails assessment of proposed risk reduction measure from the point of view of cost efficiency. Efficiency is examined by means of cost benefits comparisons which imply assessing benefits procured or expected to be procured from the measure against cost like to be incurred. Risk perception. Risk perception is understood as the awareness of risks, which differs among societies. Poor countries with other precise problems do not attach too much priority to disaster mitigation. General level of awareness among people regarding significance of disaster mitigation and preparedness is also quite low. Consequently, there is less interest articulation for policy inputs in this area. On the other hand, risk perception is found to be quite high in the developed world where much effort has been put in disaster mitigation efforts, though vulnerability is low as compared to developing countries. It has been stated that risk perception depends on the following four specific factors: CO1, SS1, and promotion 1994, exposure, actual quantitative risk level as articulated through risk assessment, familiarity, personal experience which makes one alive to the dangers of disaster, dread, honor of the disaster scale and consequences which make policy imminent, preventability, belief in prevention method which leads to disaster mitigation policy, risk identification. Risk identification. The political representatives informally do risk assessment as part of daily governance, which is to justify legislations of in foreign policy, the judicial system, the law enforcement, etc. Risk assessment are now being conducted in more sophisticated ways, particularly in the field of environmental legislation. Risk has to be empirically assessed for which subjective biases arising due to cultural or ideological inclinations need to be kept out of policy judgments. The best example of risk assessment comes from the insurance industry, where the insurer have well-defined roles of actuary, underwriter, agent, auditor, and adjuster. Each of these is an assessor in somewhat different circumstances or stages of the reinsuring, adjustment, recovery, and claims payment process. Hence, risk assessment is a continuous process of articulation which need to be undertaken periodically at every stage or phases in a said activity or process. Objectivity of the risk assessment depends on the availability of adequate and timely data. A risk, essentially in the context of disasters, is the probability that injury to life or damage to property and to the environment may happen. However, in disaster management, risk refers to the combined sustainability and vulnerability of the community to potential damage caused by a particular hazard within a specified time period. Risk is rooted in conditions of physical, social, economic, and environmental vulnerability that need to be assessed and managed on a continuing basis. Further, for understanding the above concepts, a technical evaluation process is usually undertaken, commonly called hazards assessment, vulnerability analysis, and risk analysis. These are structured analytical procedures for identifying hazards and estimate the probability of their occurrence and consequences given certain conditions. Taken altogether, a similar structured analysis and of actual or potential vulnerabilities. These estimations are compared with a standard criteria in order. These estimations are compared with the standard criteria in order to decide whether or not an action is desirable to reduce the probabilities or to protect the people, property, or environment. Realistically, it is necessary to also to consider that to what extent perceived constraints of time and resources may slow down the application of desirable countermeasures. Hazards and vulnerabilities are aggregated into risks. Risks can be seen subjectively or objectively analyzed and or perce- perceived. A subjective risk in the risks perceived by the people affected, which determine their willingness to accept a potential hazard and take steps to tackle it. Understanding vulnerability gives the extent to which a community is affected by a disaster. It involves the measure of resilience and coping capacity of a community in the face of adversity. Resilience and coping capacity develop over time as a result of proactive government policies. Vulnerability is an inclusive concept in which vulnerability of a particular community to a particular type of disaster, flood, or earthquake is a resultant effect of a number of factors which include physical factors, geographical perspective, sociological perspective, and economic factors, income and unemployment, involving micro and macroeconomic policies, besides institutional or administrative, which are essentially governance related issues. The process of vulnerability has been evidenced as proceeding along phases as follows root causes, dynamic pressure that translate these into active problems, which are the result of a priority decision making in governance related matters over time. For example, drought in a dryland area leading to a famine in the absence of disaster mitigation efforts. Social scientists and climate scientists often interpret vulnerability differently. Social scientists tend to view vulnerability as representing the set of socioeconomic factors that determine people's ability to cope with stress or change. Alliance 2003 climate scientists often view vulnerability in terms of that of the likelihood of occurrence and impact of weather and climate related events. Related terms are fragility, stability, resilience, and sensitivity of a system. These are the constituents of vulnerability. There are some definition of vulnerability and vulnerability assessment like vulnerability is the likelihood that the individual or group will be exposed to and adversely affected by a hazard. It is the interaction of the hazard of place, risks, and mitigation with the social profile and communities. Carter 1903 by vulnerability, we mean the characteristics of a person or a group in terms of their capacity to anticipate, cope with, resist, and recovers from the impact of a natural hazard. It involves a combination of factors that determine the degrees to which someone's life and livelihood are put at risk by a discrete and identified indefinite undefinable event in nature or society. So, gravity is convinced as both physical risk and social response within a specific location or time. The science of ecology, as Turner and Benjamin have pointed out, lacks a precise accepted definition of ecosystem fragility. Ecologists use fragility to denote a system at risk, where the notion of risk is linked to ecological concepts of stability and instability and susceptibility. The chain of linkages characterizing the system provides the ecological base for the notion of fragility. This complex internal structure of the organic ties of specifies at risk. It is receiving detailed analysis in the emerging field of ecological risk assessment. According to Howling 1986, stability is the propensity of a system to attain and retain the equilibrium condition of a steady state and stable oscillation, whereas resilience is the ability of a system to maintain its structure and patterns of behavior in the face of disturbance. Sensitivity is used to measure the magnitude of negative impact of environment change. Change can have both positive and negative impact on human societies. Blakey and Brookfield in 1987 used the term sensitivity and resilience to describe the quality of land system. They use sensitivity to refer to the degree to which a given land system undergoes change due to natural forces following human interference, and resilience to refer the ability of land to reproduce its capability after interference, and the measure of the need for human artifice to the end. In such manner, we may define sensitivity or susceptibility as the degree of ecosystem or ecosystem component changes associated with a given degree of human induced stress, and resilience as the ability of a particular ecosystem to maintain the basic structure essential to support human users during perturbation and to recover from such and especially damaging changes. Fragility reflects both of these properties of human ecosystem interactions. This way, fragility, fragility is the sensitivity of a particular ecosystem of human-induced perturbation and its resilience to such perturbation. Green 1990, in reference to flood hazards, expresses vulnerability as a relationship between changing conditions and normal use patterns. He defines vulnerability as a function of susceptibility, the context to which the presence of water will affect inputs or outputs of an activity. Dependency, the degree to which an activity requires a particular good as an input to function normally, and transferability, the ability of an activity to respond by defining demand using substitutes or relocating. Vulnerability identification. Vulnerability is defined as the conditions determined by physical, social, economic, and environmental factors or process, which increases the susceptibility of a community to the hazards. Vulnerability identification implies examining the root causes of vulnerability that could lie in technological, physical, or socio-economic conditions and addressing the same through empirical research and policy. Identification of vulnerability is challenging because in that complex process interact is resultant vulnerability of a system or a specific region or peoples. Tackling vulnerability involves both short-term and long-term measures in that the problem of vulnerability has essentially comes across as a problem of development. The solution therefore lies in policy analysis of developmental planning with a view to making sustainable development measures more precise and need-based with respect to reducing of vulnerability. Types of vulnerability. Type and nature. Type and nature. Material economic vulnerability, inadequate access to resource, social vulnerability, disintegration, disintegration of local institution and structure, ecological vulnerability, degradation of environment and inability to protect it, organizational vulnerability, lack of strong central state and grassroots institutional structure, educational vulnerability, insufficient access to information and knowledge, attitudinal and motivational vulnerability, low level of public awareness and desire to change, political vulnerability, limited access to political power and representation, cultural vulnerability, blind faith in beliefs and customs, physical vulnerability, weak building and other infrastructure as well as physical weak or vulnerable people. Vulnerability and risk assessment. The international community, pioneered by the United Nations, has attempted to analyze disaster over time and prepare an inventory or causes that lead to them, the extent or damage suffered, what and how mitigation need to be applied, and where where successfully risk assessment is an investigation into the disaster phenomenon through detailed study and investigation of repeat events over time, such as floods or earthquakes, assessment of damage and estimation of future losses possible in the absence of disaster mitigation measures, vulnerability assessment in a subset of risk assessment, which analyze differential vulnerability of communities in differential areas of disaster impact, such as increasing or decreasing degrees of prone, hazard prones. Precise quantification of risks, however, is difficult. At best, a gross estimation of risks is possible. For example, number of deaths and the number of people exposed to hazards. Such crude estimate give only a limited idea of the likely damage from a hazard for different people at different places or even the probability of its occurrence. Vulnerability analysis entails assessing the loss of life and property from a particular hazard striking at a particular intensity. For example, X number of people are expected to be killed in and property rose or destroyed if a cyclone strikes with strong winds at 130 km per hour. Disaster vulnerability need to be studied over time. It does not happen all of the sudden, rather communities gradually slip into the disaster mode. Thus, comprehensively, disaster vulnerability is understood both as products and process in three main aspects: as product of ongoing social, cultural, and economic transformation process within communities, as product of normal underdevelopmental process, and as product of immediate and long-term disaster response. An attempt should be made at redefining disasters in a dynamic and integrated perspective, integrating sociocultural, developmental, and ecological outlook, the desirable in an academic analysis of vulnerability with the practical perspective of policy designing. Design should include development of an integrated perspective integrating sociocultural, developmental, and ecological perspective to develop a comprehensive framework on disaster mitigation. Emphasis on poverty alleviation and community empowerment through local control on land and material resources, cultural continuity and compatibility, sustainability of livelihoods, equitable participation through empowerment, ethics, roles, and responsibilities of local governance. Vulnerability factors. The concept of vulnerability cover, covers risks of hazards and the measure of risks combined with the relative inability to cope with the resulting stress. Tamaran Man 1981 defined vulnerability at the society or community scale as the degree to which a system or part of a system reacts adversely to a hazardous event. Most signs of reducing system scale vulnerability can be seen as expression of either resilience or reliability. Anderson 1000 showed how the concept of human vulnerability has been refined through time, although there is still no fully acceptable and discipline-free definition available. Resilience is a measure of the rate of recovery from a stressful experience, reflecting the social capacity to observe and recover from the occurrence of a hazardous event. Traditionally, resilience has been the main weapon against hazards in poverty dominated areas where disaster is often accepted as a normal part of a of life. In this situation, community coping strategies are important. For example, nomadic herdsmen in semi-arid areas have tended to accumulate cattle during years with good grazing lands on an insurance against drought. Reliability, on the other hand, reflects the frequency with which protective devices against hazards fail. This approach is applicable to developed areas where technology and engineering design have provided what is perceived, perceived to be a high degree of reliability. For most urban services, where however extreme stress, for example from an earthquake, can easily disrupt road networks, electric power lines, or water system. In Asia and the Pacific, a significant number of people lost their lives from natural disaster over the past 45 years. The region was only hit by around 43% of the disaster experienced globally, but the impact of these disasters in terms of lives lost was notable. Between 1970 and 2014, more than 2 million people died, accounting for 56.6% of the total deaths in the world due to disaster. The impact on susceptibility of Asian and Pacific countries to disaster is evident when considering the total number of people affected. Over 6 billion people in the region have suffered from natural disaster, accounting for 87.6% of the global total. In ESCAP 2015, most of these people are in poor regions where vulnerability arises from poverty, discrimination, lack of democratic functioning, hampering the development process. The poorest people often have little choice but to live in unsafe settings, whether it is urban sanitage or degraded rural environments. In terms of loss of life and relative economic impact, disasters hit hardest where poverty stricken people are concentrated in less developed countries. Rural inhabitants rural inhabitants outnumber people in the urban areas. Even then, now there are more urban dwellers in the third world than in Europe, North America, and Japan in total. Metropolitan cities are growing at faster rate. In urban squatter settlements, population densities may reach as high as 10 times of present level. Many buildings without suitable material or construction skills are erected on steps, slopes, or flood-prone land exposed to strong winds and landslides. In highly populated rural areas, population density can exceed 1,000 per kilometer square, and life is a recurrent struggle to secure cult- cultivable land. Many people are landless and disadvantaged by land tenure systems, which deny them access to the means to support themselves. As has been rightly pointed out, the study of the vulnerability of human and natural systems to climate change and vulnerability and of their ability to adapt the changes in climate hazards is a relatively neat field of research that brings together experts from a wide range of fields, including climate science, developmental studies, disaster management, health, geography, policy, development, economics, to name but a few areas. There is need for an integrating framework to bring together diverse traditions in a coherent yet flexible fashion, allowing researchers to assess vulnerability and the potential for adoption in a wide variety of different contexts. APC 2001. Both natural and man-made factors contribute to vulnerability. Some of the contributing factors are described below. Population displacement. Population displacement is both as a cause and consequence of disaster. There is evidence of correlation between poverty and economic inequality and rural to urban migration. In that more the level of poverty, More is the extent of rural to urban migration. The phenomenon is most observed in poor third world countries, where the poor migrate from rural to urban areas in search of livelihood options. The social order remains basically oligarchic and oligopolistic in that inequality in income and wealth distribution persists. System change through soft democratic options such as legislation and rhetoric is not successful as entrenched powers are hard to reconcile to socialist philosophy. Result has been corruption and implementation hurdles. More specifically, at the implementation level, this largely explains why land reforms and social forestry the legislation have not met with expected success. While the size of agricultural holdings has gradually reduced, exploitation at the handle of rich and resourceful farmers has persisted. Frequently, droughts have compounded existing problems. The cumulative effect of such conditions has been mass migration of rural folk to urban metropolitan towns. Urbanization. Rural to urban migration has led to unmanageable urbanization and urban congestion that has forced human and physical capital extension in high-risk zones. Consequently, the loss potential of hazard has gone up. Urbanization has brought in its wake growth of informal settlements, unsafe living conditions, disease, class conflict, and social capital depletion, as some segments have been socially and economically marginalized. Globalization has also contributed in many ways to increasing the vulnerability of the urban poor by creating uncertain conditions regarding unemployment through the obvious impact seems to be betterment of life and better opportunities for all. Through urbanization is a worldwide spread water phenomenon. It is more pronounced in the third world because of the above recounted factors. Illustrations to this effect from India substantiate it. As per the 2011 census figures, provision of 377 million, that is 31.16% of the total population, lived in 735 cities and towns in the country. The number of cities and towns has increased by 2,774 since last census. Corresponding figures from the first census of India, the 1901 census, indicate that 25.8 million persons, that is one-tenth of the total population, lived in 1917 cities and towns. It thus shows vast increase in the number of proportion of total population living in cities and towns since the first century 2011. On the other hand, population displacement is also a consequence of disaster. In the event of disaster, large-scale displacement of population from affected areas take place, which leads to temporary and permanent loss of livelihood for people. Small-scale industries and micro-enterprises are particularly hit. Much work has not been done in providing insurance against disaster to people residing in hazard-prone areas. Though some initiatives have been taken, all disasters have not yet been covered properly, and resource mobilization also is far from adequate. The hard to relocation options have been also to be carefully weighed so as not to result in unintended consequences that negate the very purpose of the exercise. Unintended consequences as different forms of vulnerability that might be induced because of relocation. For example, loss of livelihood for small businessmen because of increased distance from urban commercial centers. Migration also has significant cultural impact besides the more obvious physical dislocation of population is in that mass migration in induced communities the to alien culture practice which destroys the cultural homogeneity of a community in extreme conditions. They can cause civil stratific different buildings practice and construction terminologies that may be introduced which might be unsuited unsuited to the requirements of that particular area. Besides, administrative and political problems are caused due to the influx of refugees which disturb the political and social matrix of the region, like the influx of Bangladeshi refugees did in India following the 1971 war, epidemics and cognition are other administrative problems caused due to mass influx of refugees. Gender Gender-based vulnerability is an assertion over time which causes disempowerment of women in social, economic, and political spheres. Gender inequality in social, economic, and political spheres results in vast difference between men and women in ability, communication, household decision about use of relief assets, vulnerability leave and recovery work, access to evacuation shelter and relief goods and employment in disaster planning, relief and recovery programs are among other areas of concern in disaster relief. Disaster mitigation is also response policy, particularly concerning control over relief resources, have to factor this component in decision making with the view to making it more equitable and on the whole more effective. Economic factors. Close correlation has been evidence between poverty, disaster, and environmental degradation. Relative vulnerability of people is comparatively much higher in developing third world countries than in the developed world. As per United Nations estimates, although less developed countries shows less physical exposure to hazards, 11%, they account for far greater number of casualties, 33%. On the other side, the most developed countries represent more 15% physical exposure to hazards and account for significantly less 2.8% victims. The inference drawn is that the magnitude of disaster suffered is directly correlated to the level of development, which explains to largely the fact of the third world accounting for significantly more losses than the developed countries. This difference is shown by a list of disaster events and fatalities over 1960s 82. Japan suffered 43 earthquakes and other disasters and lost 2,700 people. That means 63 days per disaster. Peru suffered 31 disasters with 91,000 dead. The vast majority lost in the single event of the 1970 earthquake. This is the graph of the economic damage billion in USD in the world 1987 to 2016. Okay, the World Economic Action and wars against the poor whole have little opportunity to process and market what they produced, and they dependent on the imports from the industrialized nation for manufactured goods, which are quite often unstable. The poor regions have little opportunity to process and market what they produce, and they are dependent on the import from the industrialized nations on manufactured goods, which are often highly precise or tied to add package on the progressive hardship for the small-scale farmer, combined with a foreign debt burden that may be many times the normal annual export earnings takes research away and destroy from long-term development in a process that has been described as a transfusion of blood from the sick to the healthy. The cycle is reinforced with when natural disaster destroys local products and undermine incentives for investment. Major disasters such as the drought disrupts and destroys local and economics and brings shortage in neighboring region. As a result, create vulnerability international refugee and stimulate aid programs to the extent that the consequences of environmental hazards are truly global. The World Meteorological Organization WMO reports on Atlas of mortality and economic losses from weather climate extreme events mentioned that around 2682 extreme events have occurred in Asia during 1972 to 2012, resulting in 0.92 million deaths and US $798.8 billion of economic damages. WMO World Meteorological Organization 2015 report. The above diagram shows that the economic damage caused by natural disaster in the year 2016 is increasing from the year 2015. By contrast, in the 5-year period average analysis in the 2012-2016 average is a decrease ADRC 2017. Poverty situation increases vulnerability to disaster and contributes in enabling poverty. In order to facilitate sustainable development, it is essential to eliminate this vicious circle. The sustainable development with emphasis on the long-term and integrational aspects also enables us to face challenges. Compatibility between economic growth and sustainable development demands a method to measure the kind of growth that encompasses all important aspects pertaining to quality of life, such as human exposure to risk situation and specifies and lifestyles. Geographical factors. Global warming threatens to distribute agriculture in developing countries through most greenhouse gas emission has taken place from the developed world. Global warming has particularly increased the vulnerability of coastal areas, especially in the small island development state. The sea level rise will threaten this fragile ecosystem of these regions, raising the frequency and intensity of natural hazards like tsunamis, cyclones, floods, and storm surge. Coastal zones, wetlands, and coral reefs are likely to be harmed, which act as a natural buffers against hazards like cyclones. The magnitude of disaster is also likely to be greater because of the increased pace of infrastructure development that has taken place in this region in the last few years owing to population pressure and growing achievements of this region from the point of view of tourism even deeper to finally conclusion shift of emphasis from disaster response to risk reduction has opened up areas of explore, exploratory research in the subject of disaster management. Vulnerability analysis seek to preempt disaster management by ensuring timely preparedness on the part of people and institutions and government agencies involved. Disaster management is an imminent administrative task for reduction of disaster through prevention, preparedness, mitigation, and response. There has been a parag- paradigmatic shift of emphasis in the last decade from disaster relief and rehabilitation to prevention and mitigation strategic post-occurrence treatment of disasters has proved an insufficient measure for proper protection of lives and property. There is also an emphasis on mainstreaming disaster management in everyday governance by treating it as integral to policy formation and implementation process. In keeping within it, the focus in this unit has been on hazard, risks and vulnerability. Okay, so these are the some reference you can find here, and you can also search in copy from here and search in Google. Okay, thank you.